Please take your seats. The show is about to begin. Please take your seats. The show is about to begin.
Welcome aboard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us at Axios House today. We've had some such important conversations, and I'm delighted to continue those with you now this afternoon. And by the way, if you're following along on social media, please make sure to use the hashtag Axios House. My next guest is a top voice for climate policy in the United States. Please welcome National Climate Advisor, Assistant to the President, Ali Zaidi. Thank you for being here with us at Axios House.
Wonderful
again
to be with
to discuss climate.
Wonderful to be with you.
We are still more than a month out for the election, but I imagine the clock that you're racing towards is the final few months of the Biden administration. I feel like even just today, I've seen you talk in 4 or 5 different places. Has there ever been a time in the past 4 years where you haven't felt like you weren't working overtime?
Well, we all should be working overtime because we are way behind the clock on climate, but we're catching up. We're making progress. You know, my team kids, we define our strategic planning on the Climate Policy Office staff in 3-month sprints. The punchline is there's no pause between the sprints. So that's
and
how
what is this final one then?
Look, this last one is so important. We've got a bunch of our infrastructure law, our Inflation Reduction Act left to implement, make sure all of those investments are having maximum benefit on the ground. We've got some rulemakings and standards to finalize. And then, you know, one of the big things that we try to focus on is just blocking and tackling on the ground to get things built. And that's a big focus for us in these last few months. Sprint to the finish line.
Let's talk about some of those. I was actually talking to someone from Long Beach, a port official who was here this morning, who is eagerly awaiting the result of their $400 million application. We actually had an event in Long Beach last week where we were talking about decarbonization efforts, the big EPA recipient grant that they got there for air pollution. You all have announced billions of dollars from the IRA in just the past few months. So as we think about all of this, what are the top priorities first when it comes to just IRA implementation, funding, authorizing, getting that money out the door?
Yeah, I wish there were a sort of a single bottom line answer to it. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things we've tried to do as an administration is focus sector by sector. For a really long time, I think the climate conversation was a narrow one. Folks focused on electricity or maybe on transportation. In this administration, we've had a senior director on my team for every sector of the economy. So that means we've got a top priority for the power sector, which is making sure that we get more transmission lines built and the tech-neutral tax credits for the Inflation Reduction Act finalized. For the transportation sector, it means building more momentum behind the heavy-duty and freight decarbonization push. Light-duty vehicles, the story's been remarkable. Quadrupled EV sales, doubled EV charging, but these programs, the heavy-duty ones, are really important to get done. In the industrial sector, we're making sure that we're engaging more aggressively in this international conversation around climate and trade so that clean steel, clean cement, clean aluminum is stuff we're manufacturing here in the United States, and it's not getting out-dumped by dirty products from overseas, agriculture, and so on, the list goes. So there's not one priority, but I think if you had to bottom line it, it's getting things built.
I want to come back to the overseas stuff in a minute, but first I just want to ask about, apart from financing, there's also a lot of implementation about different regulatory steps. What does that look like in this final sprint?
Yeah, look, one of the regulatory pieces has to do with the tax code, right? So when we set rules, for example, for clean hydrogen, which we will do by the end of the year, that's really important for us to get right the conversation on additionality, on making sure that we are putting new clean electrons on the grid that are getting turned into hydrogen, and that we're doing it in a way that's conducive to the nuclear industry, others playing a big role. So there's the regulatory piece inherent in the spending. There's a second regulatory piece which has to do with platform development. So that sounds a little esoteric. I'll boil it down. Platform development, especially for voluntary carbon markets. So we launched this big push on measurement, monitoring, verification. People say, what role can ML and AI play in climate change? One role they can play is taking all this new satellite data that we have and helping us in almost a real-time fashion figure out if we're getting dollars back on investments to reduce methane leaks, on investments to improve climate-smart agriculture practices. We have the tools, we just have to build them out and implement them. And then, of course, there's the core regulatory piece, the stuff people sort of think about when they think environmental policy in the United States. And we're going to finalize lead and copper rule to get all the lead pipes out. We are going to make sure that we make progress on cleaning up additional pollution from the power sector, not just CO2, but frankly, other pollutants. $8 trillion a year is the healthcare cost globally of air pollution. So we have a share of that, and we're going after that pretty relentlessly here in the United States.
Earlier this morning, we had both John Kerry and Al Gore say that one of their reasons for optimism is actually China, the speed at which China is producing renewable energy as well as products to help with that. Of course, we know that the Biden administration has imposed tariffs on Chinese-made EVs, solar cells, other climate tech. How do you all balance the national security and the idea that these products, to your point, maybe are not made in the most environmentally friendly way with the speed at which climate activists want Americans to be adapting and using these products so we have a green economy?
Yeah, a lot of tension there in just what you laid out. And there's a lot of tension in implementation, which is why it's hard. We're halfway through the decisive decade for climate action, as the UNFCCC defined it. And one of the things I think everybody who's in the game is realizing is building, executing, handling all of these tensions is not easy, and it's certainly not easy for our current institutions. And so we need institution evolution. I don't think we should tolerate the fact that solar panels built in the United States are half as clean as solar panels manufactured somewhere else. But from a global trade perspective, there's no global regime accounting for that. There's no global regime accounting for U.S. steel being twice as clean as steel produced, for example, in China. We need our trade institutions to rise up to that. So I think thing number one of how do you handle this tension in the system is actually to have institution evolution, especially on topics like trade, which is absolutely necessary.
And is that in the private sector then, or how do you...
No, that's a public sector conversation.
Okay.
I think the public sector, and we're having these conversations. I've talked to the Europeans about this, the UK, others who are stepping up to the plate in a big way in this discussion. We've got to propel that forward. But maybe to come back to a different node in what you laid down, because it's such a, I think, sophisticated question. One of the pieces there is this idea of, well, shouldn't we just buy stuff that's cheaper somewhere else and just throw it on the roof? I think there is such a thing as being penny wise, pound foolish in the clean energy transition. If we have very concentrated, brittle supply chains that are vulnerable to the kind of disruption, for example, we saw with the chips supply chain, that's a big problem. And that's why I think this task that the president's been on, which has now yielded $900 billion in manufacturing investment into the United States, not just here in the United States, but with all of our allies and partners around the world, to build resilience and bring more partners into critical minerals, into upstream solar, upstream batteries, and all the way downstream around the world. That's critical.
So that's also a huge cultural change, though, right? Like you're saying that you want people to think about, even if they're investing in green technology, paying much more for a product that's American made, that's cleaner. How does that cultural message get out there? Like, how do you message that?
Well, first, it's value, not cost, right? And from a value perspective, you're asking people to pay for something that unlocks a lot more benefit. And, you know, we're in New York. People know the difference between the pair of jeans that last you 10 times and the pair of jeans that you'll never get rid of, right? People know inherently the difference in the value proposition. And I think we've got to lean into that. But, you know, I think there's, well, I'll leave it at that.
I want to switch gears here. A lot of Democrats say that the fact that a lot of IRA money has been funneled to red states helps make this durable. I heard you talk earlier this morning about the durability of the IRA. We also know that the Republican Party follows former President Trump. So I want to ask you what is your definition of durable, specifically when Trump says, I'm going to stop all our IRA funding as soon that hasn't gone out yet. I'm going to roll back everything that the Biden administration has done. What is your definition of durable in the face of that?
Yeah. Well, three things prefaced by one. The first is I'm not going to speak to the campaign or to any person running for president. I will say this. House Republicans have taken 50 votes to try to roll back parts of the climate agenda that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have advanced. They failed. The politics of climate inaction are deteriorating, and there's a very good reason for it. And it's a reason, you don't have to listen to me, articulated by 18 Republicans, a dozen and a half, who wrote to their own speaker in the House and said, hey, we got to give up on this exercise of trying to roll back this stuff because the economics are just so good in our districts. The jobs, the foreign direct investment, the manufacturing rebound, this stuff is what propels us going forward. So second point is, I think there's a economic approach that the president's taken to climate, which is a real change the equation. He's changed the equation by making climate a conversation not about sacrifice or about what we don't do, but actually trying to forge a new environmental consensus. And that's a new environmental consensus about growth the right way, about building things in an inclusive way, infrastructure, manufacturing, and the middle class. And I think that's what makes this lasting and allows us to go the distance.
That's your definition of how you're thinking about it as durable. You have talked in the past about energy jobs growing twice as fast over the past year. Do you think that we have the workforce readiness when it comes to people having the skills, Americans having the skills to fill these jobs?
No. I think that we spend so much time, for example, on artificial intelligence, we spend so much time thinking about chips. Now people are starting to think about poles and wires. The real conversation is, will we have the electricians to ensure U.S. dominance on this critical technology?
For the people to operate the energy centers,
Absolutely.
To power, right.
And so it's the steel workers, and it's the electricians, and it's the machinists, and it's the pipe fitters that will ensure we go as fast as we need to. That is a key part of our industrial capacity, is our human capital pipeline. And that's why this morning I joined with a group of governors to launch a push to get 1 million more folks graduated from registered apprenticeships within a decade. That's going to be critical to our ramp up. And by the way, I think it not only is the clean energy sector growing twice as fast as the rest of the sector, it is twice in terms of union density as the rest of the private sector. And that union density, I think, is actually part of our secret sauce in winning this race.
I know you're not going to preempt your boss, but what can we expect from President Biden tomorrow morning?
You know, I remember way back when the primary that preceded this last election, not the one right now, but the one in 2020. And right at the beginning of that primary cycle, the UNFCCC declared this the decisive decade for climate action. The way I think about what the president is going to go do tomorrow is deliver the halftime report for the decisive decade for climate action. And I think what he'll say is, when you look at the scoreboard, 100 gigawatts of clean energy deployed just in the last 3.5 years, hundreds of factories opened up, in particular in places where jobs had left and factories had been shuttered. We have everything we need to win on climate. Everything we need to win on climate. But we've got to stay the course as a global community. And frankly, we got to move the trillions of dollars of capital that are still parked on the sidelines into the fight of our lives, because there's returns to be had, there's money to be made, and we will be successful if people are chasing after the opportunity rather than just sitting around observing the glory of the doom and gloom conversation, which gets us nowhere.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but that's a great place to end. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Ali Zaidi, Deputy National Climate Advisor. Thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Nicholas Johnston. I'm the publisher of Axios. Thanks so much for joining us here this afternoon. This is our very first Axios House at Climate Week. We're very excited. We're in the middle of a blockbuster series of conversations. We're very grateful you're here. We're also very grateful for all of our partners. Everything we do at Axios wouldn't be possible without the support of our partners. So we're very grateful to Paige for making today's conversation possible. And before the conversation continues, a quick video message from the folks at Paige.
For 2 decades, the U.S. has been a global leader in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by replacing coal power plants with cleaner natural gas. Unfortunately, the world is moving in the wrong direction. Global coal consumption is on the rise. Some countries are having to reactivate their dormant coal plants just to keep the lights on and their economies running, threatening our hard-earned progress and the world in which we live. But there's a solution. Increasing low emissions intensity U.S. liquid natural gas exports to replace foreign coal can get the world back on track towards achieving our global climate goals and providing energy security, all while delivering cleaner, more reliable, and affordable energy for all.
And now, I'm very excited to welcome to the stage for a view from the top conversation, the CEO of EQT, a founding member of the coalition, Toby Z. Rice. Toby, welcome to Axios House. Let's start big picture. Talk a little bit about why you're here, why Paige is here, what are your goals, what is the message you're bringing as you meet with folks in industry and policymakers in town today?
Yeah, we're excited to be here at Climate Week in New York City. You know, EQT is America's largest natural gas producer. We produce over 6 BCF a day of natural gas, which is the energy equivalent of almost 1 million barrels a day of energy. So why are we here at Climate Week? Because when you're talking about climate, you're talking about energy. And we want to be part of that conversation. You know, it's never been a more important time to produce energy in the United States, whether that is fueling our allies with our LNG and meeting the growing demand of our allies overseas, or powering this AI revolution that's taking place in our shores. But unfortunately, it's never been more difficult to produce energy in this country. Something that Ali was talking about, summarized very simply, it's really hard to get stuff built in this country. And for clean energy like natural gas production, we've built fewer miles of pipelines last year on an annual basis than we had in the prior 30 years. The last big pipeline that got completed took an act of Congress to make happen. It's never been more difficult. And when we look at the scoreboard, there's a need for a whole heck of a lot more. Emissions are still rising. Energy security of our allies is still crippled. Energy poverty is increasing, and we need to be doing a whole heck of a lot more. And that's why we started Paige, to reset the conversation and focus people on real, proven, scalable energy solutions. And our journey started with one question, not just asking what can our countries do within our borders, it's what can our countries do to lower emissions outside of our borders. And when you start with that question, some really amazing opportunities present themselves, like American natural gas. And the U.S. LNG is the world's biggest green initiative on the planet. Using our natural gas to replace foreign coal is one of the biggest things we can do to lower global emissions. And as a reminder, foreign coal is the biggest source of emissions on the planet. So if you care about emissions, care about that. U.S. LNG is really the only big major league thing that we can do to export our climate excellence around the world. And our opportunity here in the United States is massive. The United States, thanks to the shale revolution, has a natural gas resource base that would allow us to quadruple our LNG exports, exporting up to 60 BCF a day of natural gas And to put that in perspective, the decarbonizing impact of doing that would have the equivalent of electrifying every vehicle in the country, putting solar panels on every house in America, and doubling U.S. wind capacity combined. This is a massive solution. And the last part, from an energy security perspective, 60 BCF a day of natural gas doesn't mean a lot to the normal person. But that's an amount of energy that's equivalent to adding over 10 million barrels a day of clean energy to the world stage. That is like adding another Saudi Arabia of clean energy. That's going to be a decarbonizing force that's going to bring tremendous peace and prosperity to the world while also lowering our global emissions.
You mentioned how on the construction, on the permitting issue, like Ali seems to agree with you a little bit. There was another topic challenge he raised, which was methane emissions, which is a big piece of this. Talk a little bit about how you approach that at EQT about dealing with rising methane emissions.
Well, we think any natural gas-focused solution has to address the elephant in the room. And clearly, methane emissions is the biggest environmental concern about our industry today. And I'll tell you what we told Secretary Granholm 3 years ago. We said, if you're concerned over methane, keep the bullseye there, because we're going to knock methane emissions out of the park. And let me tell you a little bit about America's largest natural gas producer in our journey, because we are on the doorstep of being net zero by 2025. So first, people need to understand the massive operational efficiencies that have taken place in our industry, specifically at EQT. You know, drilling wells faster, completing wells more efficiently. We're producing record amounts of energy production in this country. We used to run over 2,000 rigs in this country. Now we're running around 600. Okay, so think about the amount of efficiencies that have taken place. Naturally, that will lower your emissions. But the biggest things that we can do is we understand where these methane emissions are coming from. And for natural gas producers, it comes from one piece of equipment called a pneumatic device, and we can replace that equipment with other non-emitting devices. And at EQT, we pulled out over 9,000 of these devices across our entire asset base. And we did it quickly in less than 18 months, and we did it cost effectively for a cost of less than $30 million. And when you do the math, the cost of this translated to less than $10 per ton. Super cost effective. And it was incredibly impactful. That initiative alone lowered our carbon footprint by over 300,000 tons.
Is this part of the message that delivering sort of to policymakers this week to help them understand that?
Absolutely. It's a key part of it. And the other part that's so important is to let people know these opportunities don't just lie within EQT. These opportunities exist across all other operators. And this industry is taking this very serious, and we're taking action. In the U.S. since 2020, methane emissions are down 23%. We're going to continue on that trajectory. And you see last year at COP, major announcements. Over 40% of the world's production has signed up to have to the oil and gas decarbonization charter. That is going to require near zero methane emissions by 2030. Now, EQT is well along that journey. And like I said, we're going to be announcing net zero by 2025. And let me just tell you why this is important. We cannot let the emissions associated with making our product overshadow the emission reduction benefits when people use our product. Now, using EQT as an example, our carbon footprint after all the initiatives that we've done is around 200,000 tons. This is America's largest producer. 200,000 tons. That includes methane emissions. And people are saying that we should shut down natural gas development because of that carbon footprint. Well, understand this. That carbon footprint is going to produce an amount of natural gas when put on the world stage to replace coal is going to have a decarbonizing impact of negative 180 million tons. So 200,000 ton cost for 180 million ton benefit. This is one of the greatest deals in climate. And so to focus people on the benefits, we are going to be addressing methane emissions. And in our case at EQT, we're going to be net zero by 2025. Forcing the conversation on all the great work that we can do when people use natural gas to replace higher emitting sources.
So Ali wasn't allowed to talk about the election, but maybe you can. From your vantage point, what's your view of how policymakers are adjusting to the role of natural gas in this? Where do you think voters are? It's kind of an interesting topic in this campaign.
Well, let's start. This may sound like a political answer, but this is true. I've spent over a lot of trips going to D.C. over the last 24 months talking about unleashing U.S. LNG on the world stage. And we've met with politicians from both sides of the aisle. Let me tell you what we all agree on. Every politician wants more affordable energy. Every politician wants more reliable energy. every politician wants cleaner energy. So we all agree on this. Now we need to open people some eyes up into making this happen. And as I mentioned, how hard it is to get pipelines built in this country, how to get natural gas infrastructure built, the talking point that we hear from DC is they say, Tobe, you can't cry about how hard it is because America has never been a larger producer of oil and natural gas. And that is true. America has become the world leader in oil production. We have become the world leader in natural gas production. We are the world's #1 LNG exporter. But ask yourself a question. Look at the world around us and ask yourself, is that enough? Inflation is running rampant. Emissions are skyrocketing. Energy poverty for the first time in 20 years is increasing, and the security of our allies is crippled. Clearly, we are doing a lot, but we need to be doing a whole heck of a lot more. And the good news is the United States is blessed with two things: amazing resources, and even more importantly, amazing workforce and innovation. The oil and gas industry, to get those resources out of the ground and deliver the cheapest, most reliable, cleanest energy to the world stage. And it's incredibly important that we allow that to happen. And we've gotten into this situation. I think it's been real simple because as you heard from Ali, energy is incredibly political. And we have this situation where a lot of really head-scratching things are happening with energy. Like, why are we paying $30 for our natural gas in Boston when less than a couple hundred miles away, we're selling that same gas at EQT for a price of $3? Why are Americans' energy bills going up 30% if we are blessed with such these natural resources? And the reason is simple. I believe that political force has overwhelmed market forces, and that is what's led to some of these bizarre things happening in energy. What I would love to see happen is I'd love to see politicians continue to play an important role in this conversation, but we need to get back to a world where market forces drive the cheapest, most reliable, cleanest energy on the world stage. Now, how can the politicians play in this? Help us incentivize the market to make the most cost-effective energy hit the world stage. How are we incentivizing and valuing the reliable energy? How are we incentivizing the clean energy? There's a lot of different programs that are out there, but we need clear signals to the market. And then if you can engage this market, this industry, we will do amazing things like bring energy independence to America when 20 years ago we were energy dependent, and now we're the energy powerhouse on the world stage. That's the type of heavy lifting that this industry can do. And we have the opportunity in front of us. We just need the ability to get the infrastructure built.
Some good marching orders for the folks in the crowd. We're about to get the hook here. I want to end on one fun thing. You're CEO of a massive energy producer, but you got a good story about how you got that job.
Yeah, so a little bit unconventional. We sold our business, Rice Energy. I grew that. This is the American dream story. For me, it was starting an energy business, an apartment in Pittsburgh with my three brothers. 10 years later, we grew that to a top 10 producer of natural gas. We sold that business to EQT in 2017. And the combination of Rice Energy and EQT is what created America's largest natural gas producer. I went back to the house, figured out what was next in life for me. Unfortunately, got a call from some shareholders, and they asked me to come back. And so after a pretty grueling proxy contest on July 19th, July of 2019, I was
You couldn't escape.
CEO of EQT. Yeah, that's right.
They pulled you back in.
It's a good thing.
Toby, thanks for being here. Thanks to EQT and Paige for making today possible. Stick around. The conversation continues.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Cahalani-Gu. I'm executive editor at Axios. Thrilled now to continue the conversation. We're moving next to the business side, to aviation in particular. Please welcome our next guest. She's leading sustainable aviation in the airline industry, Chief Sustainability Officer at Delta Airlines, Amelia De Luca. Welcome. Nice to have you. Thank you so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sarah.
So let's talk a little bit about news in the airline industry. Of course, it's Climate Week. This morning, a little bit of news out of British Airways announcing a big investment in carbon removal for them. Delta Airlines is taking a different tact, and I believe you announced your plan about a year ago to be net zero emissions by 2050. So if it's been about a year, I'd love to know a little more detail how it's going, and maybe just as importantly, how are you going to communicate to your stakeholders, your customers, your investors, about where you are as you march towards 2050?
Great question, Sarah, and thank you all for being here today. And I imagine many of you traveled here by air. And so if you did, you obviously know, and I'll just skip the part where I explain why air travel is essential to so many things, not only our DE&I work, as well as GDP growth, as well as just all of us being here and talking about this important topic. But we are a consumer brand, and so everything we do obviously is in pursuit of making sure that our customers travel with us and have a great, safe, premium, and reliable experience, then now also sustainable. We've been saying recently that green is the new black when it comes to premium travel. At the same time, the facts are very clear. We are a hard to decarbonize sector, and 90% of our emissions come from jet fuel, which there is no solution that is scalable today to tackle that problem. So that's why you're going to hear a lot of net zero goals this week, I'm sure, and you might think 2050 seems pretty far away, but for a hard to decarbonize sector, that is quite an ambitious goal. We sometimes call it our moonshot. It's going to take us a little while, but it's going great in the sense of we are doing what we can do today to control what we can control and bring down our jet fuel footprint while trying to scale the solutions of the future. In particular, you're going to hear me talk a lot about sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, today. That is really the only scalable solution to essentially replace the fossil-based jet fuel that we use today with more sustainable feedstocks, such as used cooking oil or corn-based ethanol, or in the future, a synthetic fuel that would have a zero emissions footprint. But it's going great in the sense of, our customers are coming along with us on the journey. They really believe in the mission. 75% of our HVC customers, no matter what the generation is telling us that they expect us to be more sustainable, and they respond really positively. We'll talk in a second about our paper cup that's coming later, but they're really excited about what they're doing in terms of both what they see as well as many of the things that they don't see that we're doing every day.
Great, and I think that's the cup is a good segue, because there's short-term things that you can do as an airline and longer-term things like fuel. As someone who used to cover the airline industry, I have a warm spot in my heart for it. I do know that basically it comes down to weight, right? How much everything weighs. It's amazing even how much the paint on an airplane weighs. It's bananas. But you've been working on a cup, and so to those who may be skeptical, we have the actual cup, which I was kind of hoping would maybe look a little different than a normal airline cup. But anyway, tell us how amazing it is, or why is it going to help you towards this goal?
Well, great. Let me step back for a second, and we'll come back to the cup. And sorry that we didn't blow you away on the cup, Sarah, but I will say, as many of you probably know, getting a non-plastic lined paper cup is pretty much next to impossible. And then when you layer on the fact that it has to work in our operation, so if anyone's been on a Delta flight recently, you have best-in-class service from us, but part of that is from our amazing flight attendants who don't have the time to be unnesting cups, right? So they have to come out really quickly, and then, of course, we have such an amazing service. So if you've had an alcoholic beverage or a hot beverage or a cold beverage, it all now has to work in the same cup.
Did you say unnesting cups?
Unnesting, okay. Yeah, right. Right.
Got it. Okay.
You know what I mean? They have to come off quick. Anyways, these are things none of you want to know about, but that's the challenge of the paper cup. But let's get back to business here, which is, Yes, weight is really important, and so are many things that we put into our new aircraft in particular. So if we start about the facets of what we do, it's not only what we fly, but how we fly. And I'll start with what we fly. And obviously, we're bringing on new generation aircraft like many of our competitors every single year. And with that, we're trying to make sure we have the most efficient engines. But in particular, we're also trying to get weight off that aircraft when it comes on board. And that's the seats, it's the overhead bins. There's so many ways that you can pull weight off. But if that airplane is flying for 30 years, and for every pound that I put on there, I then have to load more jet fuel. And again, back to the problem, jet fuel is what's causing the carbon emissions. Then getting that weight off, even if it's in the small single-digit percentages, is a huge win for us. So it's what we fly. So our new aircraft, our A350-1000, which is our new flagship wide body that will start flying next year, is going to be 20% more fuel efficient than the aircraft it replaces. Those are just hard facts, and that airplane will fly for 30 years. Then the next thing you can do is on our existing aircraft, you can do a lot of different things on the edges. Again, you would never see this as a customer. Some of them are called winglets. They're on the end. Some of them are called finlets. They're on the back. That reduces drag. That's about 1%, but again, that 1% starts to add up when you consider that we burn 4 billion gallons of jet fuel every year. And then finally, we have what's called a Carbon Council, which every day throughout our 100,000 person organization sets out to save jet fuel and how we operate. And they have put on the books in the last 2.5 years, 35 million gallons of jet fuel saving annually in terms of landing procedures, getting catering weight off the aircraft, how we power an aircraft when we're at the gate. All of that has been completely changed from an operating procedure that's allowing us to save that fuel.
And you're obviously not the only airline out there running towards these goals. I do wonder, though, you mentioned aircraft being a big component of that and more efficient aircraft. Are you worried, though, about with problems with Boeing and just the supply of these aircraft that will happen? I ask because just this summer, Air New Zealand announced that it was the first airline to announce it was giving up on the goals that the industry had set. And I just would love your thoughts about whether you think that you're going to see more airlines around the globe also drop out. And what do you think about their reasoning for that, which is supply of more efficient aircraft?
Well, I think for here in the United States, the first thing I would just say, it's a really collaborative sport. And if you've covered the airlines, you know we're usually fiercely competitive. We want every customer to love us the most. When it comes to sustainability, though, we just want you to travel by air and we want you to have trust in what we're doing. And we want you to support us with many of the challenges that come, including the green premium. And so a rising tide lifts all boats in this space. And Delta really believes that. When it comes to the challenges, though, in the United States, I think the single biggest challenge is scaling sustainable aviation fuel. It's less on the supply side. Boeing and Airbus, they're great partners of ours. They will get through some of the supply chain challenges. Again, Airbus in particular is delivering some great new aircraft for us as we speak. Sustainable aviation fuel is the real challenge. It's not scaling as fast as it needs to, and that is the single most important lever that we have to pull. But I have a lot more confidence because we've had such great support from both the Biden administration as well as from states. And in particular, I see a colleague of mine from Greater Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota in particular, has been a huge support system for the scaling of sustainable aviation fuel. Both Governor Walz, who obviously has been very distracted recently, as well as the Lieutenant Governor have all said that they are SAF super fans. And they've put their money where their mouths is, putting a tax incentive at the state level that sits on top of what we're getting from the federal incentive. And so to me, I think it's way too early to abandon that. Is it easy? Absolutely not. But I think everyone has a role to play, and we've seen the government step up. We've seen the airlines step up. We're starting to see the private sector step up. And I think we've got a real shot at making some significant progress.
Well, that's great. And let's turn to that fuel question and the project that you have underway. Last year, Virgin Airlines got a lot of attention for flying a plane with cooking oil. That's not what you're doing. But tell us a little bit about where you see that playing out. Delta just made a big investment in Minnesota to begin producing this, which is a different business than what you've been in the past. And the cost is an issue, supply is an issue. So how do you see, just game this out for me and for the audience about in the years to come, where do you see this demand cost change happening, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Where do you feel it being a bigger part of the market?
Well, so we're still learning. Sustainable aviation fuel is an entirely new industry. It's nascent. It's got new players. I always say that, I grew up in the Midwest. I have very deep Midwest roots. I never thought farming would be part of my day job. And all of a sudden, I spend an immense amount of time thinking about cover crops and, emissions that can be saved through farming practices and no-till and all these things. But it's really important for sustainable aviation fuel because we don't know what the feedstock of the future will be. We just know it won't be fossil fuel-based. Today, it's used cooking oil. That's what exists and is, 80% emissions reduction. And our partners at Virgin Atlantic, we were very proud at what they proved was possible last year. But it's too early to call it, to say this is the feedstock of the future. And so we look to our Midwest farmers in our hub states of both Minnesota and Michigan who have both access to soy and corn as a potential future feedstock. But we also look and are doing a study right now, for example, in Atlanta with Airbus and Plug Power and the Atlanta airport to talk about the hydrogen economy, as that will likely be potential feedstock for the fuel or a potential power source for the aircraft in the future. In Minnesota in particular, again, very excited. It's got all these great things that you need. It's got state level support. It's got private sector support. It's got research and development support. One thing that we announced a couple of weeks ago that will, move forward this week is camelina. You may not have ever heard of camelina. That's okay. I hadn't either. It is a winter cover crop, so it's planted in between planting season in Minnesota. It's a very, very small oil seed that when crushed can similarly be turned into sustainable aviation fuel. So our partners at the University of Minnesota have been growing that crop. We have other partners that have now crushed that crop. They have turned it into sustainable aviation fuel. And later on this week, that will be part of our fuel solution in Minnesota. So the whole point right now is just to show what's possible as we try to figure out what's scalable.
Are you able to put a number on or a goal of what percentage of fuel you'd like Delta Airlines to be using by a certain date from this experiment?
Yeah, our numbers are out there and they're very public. To be net zero at 2050 requires that 100% of our fuel be sustainable aviation fuel. But the more near term would be in 2030. All U.S. airlines supported by the U.S. government have taken on a goal to have 10% of our jet fuel replaced by sustainable aviation fuel. But again, we're not picking winners yet, because we just are not quite sure which one's going to make it. And the airline industry has to compete with other industries that are trying to decarbonize, whether that's shipping or on road. And that's where, again, the government has to step in to play a role to try to say we need all of these industries to be able to decarbonize, and they can help with the pacing through the incentive structures that they put in place.
And given that, what do you feel like are the next steps beyond this experiment? You're working obviously creatively to develop this alternative fuel. But like you said, you're also operating an environment that's a global industry and also other industries that could also benefit from the same fuel, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I will answer this question the way I started, which is Delta is a consumer brand. Everything we do is in pursuit of the best customer experience. And so I think the worst thing we could do right now is choose a very short-term solution that takes that green premium and directly saddles it onto our customers. That's not the right answer. We believe that more people should travel by air, not less. We believe that the accessibility and inclusivity of our industry is really important to mankind, not to have less people on an airplane. And so Europe, for example, is looking, and they have mandates that roll out and they scale next year for sustainable aviation fuel. It's an interesting conundrum. We think that's pushing the fuel forward a little bit too fast in terms of where the supply and the green premium are. The United States, again, is really approaching it through an incentive structure that I think, if we point to Minnesota, allows us to share the risk of the green premium, where you've got the federal government that has a role, the state that has a role, the private sector that has a role. I haven't mentioned yet our other partners in the Minnesota SAF Hub are companies like Bank of America, Deloitte, McKinsey, Ecolab. Some of them have parts of that SAF value chain, and some of them are just there because they also travel by air, but they also just know it's really important to be able to decarbonize air travel. And so the future for sustainable aviation fuel, in my opinion, is to figure out how we're going to handle the green premium and how to share the risks, but really, again, with that consumer at the heart of everything that we do.
We talked earlier about politics. It is an election year. And one of the things I think you have talked about as a company is ESG, which has come under attack in part in this election. Some on the right calling it woke capitalism. I wonder what your answer is to that, because your company is putting quite a lot of money behind this.
I would point to two things. I'll start with SAF and then I'll switch into the broader company. Sustainable aviation fuel is truly a bipartisan topic because it's both helping to decarbonize air travel, but it's also really helping to support rural communities and farmers by bringing an entire industry, which is often overseas, onshore, and it's helping have that certainty that a crop like corn, for example, as on road starts to become electrified, that there is still a use case for that ethanol. And so I think we've had huge bipartisan support. The state of Georgia has become really supportive for sustainable aviation fuel. Many states, both red and blue, are supportive of SAF, which is great. I think as a company, it's just fact-based. A gallon of fuel that is saved, sure, it helps the planet. It also helps Delta's bottom line. So it's a pretty straightforward answer that I have when I get questions about that. It's cost savings today. It's future-proofing costs for the future, whether it's through regulation or just where consumer minds go. It's helping to grow market share and brand preference because it matters to consumers. It's helping to meet our customer needs where they're at. Again, a Deloitte or a Bank of America, their carbon emissions come from air travel, and so we have to meet their needs with the products that we're offering. And then finally, obviously, our employees demand it. So to me, there's 5 different reasons I can give for why this is the most important thing that Delta's doing right now, and no election outcome will change that.
All right. I have one fun thing to end the program, this segment today. You travel a lot, I imagine. You've talked about it. What is your one, as we all do, I would love to hear your one sustainable travel hack.
Sure. I will just say I always fear as a sustainability person to give advice like this because then people feel like I'm shaming them. And so just to be clear, we all have our things that we can do sustainably and things that are much harder for us to do sustainably. So wherever you're at, just we meet you there. For me, I would say a couple different things. So one, I mentioned jet fuel a couple times. If you pack more in your suitcase, that means we have to load more jet fuel on for you. So I would just say when you're thinking about your shoes choices or whatever it may be, unless you're in Vermont, which has great beer, and you need to take the beer back to Atlanta, then I'm just saying you can put the beer in the suitcase and don't worry too much about it. That's a personal example where I went against my my advice. The second thing would be public transportation or electric vehicles to the airport is really important. Bring your own water bottle. If you're traveling on Delta or a competitor where we offer a pre-select option, please pre-select. That means we won't have to load that meal. And then eventually, if you have the option to participate in sustainable aviation fuel, whether it's through your company's program or your personal program, we would really ask that you could help us support that. That means a lot to us and it goes a long way.
All right, thank you. I feel like a smarter traveler already. I don't know about you. Thank you, Amelia, for your advice, your thoughts, and stay tuned. We have one more segment.
Thank you.
Hi again, everyone. Now I feel like I have to confess how many shoes I packed this week. I feel really bad about that. Ooh, that's a good one. Our final guest is, for this program is making major news this week in the climate industry. Please welcome Bridgetown Initiative Executive Director and Senior Climate Advisor to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Dr. Pep Bardui. Hi. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm coming at the end of a long session. I don't know if that's good or bad, but
No, everyone is very interested in what you have to say. And I think we should start with the basics here when it comes to climate finance. When we think about the fact that 40% of the world's population lives in countries that spend more on debt interest payments than they do on education and health, what do you think it's going to take for countries to be able to borrow cheaper and for longer term to build more climate resilient economies in countries?
I think it's an excellent question. And for me, the starting point is always recognizing that there's a reason that countries need that financing. If there isn't recognition, not on the part of countries, because we know, I come from Dominica, which is a very small island of 70,000 people that was devastated by Hurricane Maria in 2017. It lost over $1.2 billion in losses and damages overnight, which is 200+% of GDP overnight. And so if you don't understand that countries need to not only rebuild after a disaster, but ideally invest in adaptation before a disaster, then you're going to continue to say, we don't have the money. But I think when financing institutions and development partners really kind of look at the numbers and expressly realize that for every dollar that you invest in adaptation, you save between $4 and $7 in reconstruction, then it's actually pretty good value for money. So I think what it takes is a mindset shift, which is not that we're giving you money that we don't have and we're taking away from here to give to there, but it is fundamentally a recognition that your lives matter as much as our lives. And this is actually good business sense.
One of the things that you all talk about, I think that is part of this mindset shift, is that 70% of the poorest people in the world actually live in middle income countries. And why do you think that's important when we're thinking about climate?
Look, a large challenge with middle income or emerging market economies is that they have growing populations and growing demand for the goods and services that in this current economic model we are encouraging them to consume. But they're also in large part producers, and therefore their emissions are growing both on the supply and the demand side, right, in terms of producing and consuming goods. But many of those countries are low-lying, they're coastal, they're subject to increasing disasters. And while we can think about that as having an impact on their populations alone, you should also look at the impact on supply chains. So if those are the markets that are producing, if you look at the floods from about 7 or 8 years ago and the impact that that had in Vietnam and in Thailand, the knock-on effect for supply chains, industrial zones that were shut down, and the impact on the cost of goods coming into the United States, I think you understand that it's not just an emotional decision, it's an economic decision. We live in a fundamentally interconnected world, right? We have supply chains that go from A to B to C to D. And so whatever happens over there is eventually going to hit this part of the world, be that in terms of higher cost of goods, be that in terms of no goods showing up, be that in terms of refugees. Eventually it's going to cost.
I was talking backstage to one of our guests earlier, and they were saying that they thought one of the biggest, most important things of the Bridgetown Initiative was just bringing people together with the same message. When we think about Bridgetown 3.0, what are the key messages that you want to distill out to this audience and people watching online about what that looks like?
So just by a show of hands, how many people know about Bridgetown 1.0 or 2.0 before I jump in? Okay, that's not bad. Thank you. Look, the Bridgetown Initiative initially came out of the COVID pandemic, where it was very clear that a number of countries around the world were struggling with access to liquidity. It was conceived in the capital of Barbados, Bridgetown, a country that is incredibly dependent on tourism revenues. So between 45 and 50% of GDP is indirectly or directly related to the tourism industry. And you can imagine what a lockdown did to an economy where debt to GDP went from fairly well managed, about 60, 70%, to 150% over a very short space of time. And so there's a real focus on debt and liquidity. In its third iteration, so we're now about 3 years out, entering our third year, we're looking at a range of topics under 3 key themes. So the first key theme is what I actually talked to earlier, which is we need to change the rules of the game. Until then, unless we understand that the international financial architecture, which was conceived of 50, 60 years ago, actually coming up on 80 years if you look at Bretton Woods, the world looked very different. The majority of countries in the global south were still under colonial masters. Populations looked very different, and the economic base looked very different. So which are the fastest growing economies? Which are the fastest growing populations? Largely in Africa and in Asia. Do those countries have a seat at the table in the same proportions as the global north? They don't, and therefore they don't get to make decisions about how much money goes to whom and under what conditions. So I think that's one fundamental piece, which is the rules of the game. The second is around shock-proofing economies, and here we can have a conversation about the magical money called SDRs, special drawing rights, but also other sources of liquidity to really protect the global economy that not only benefits the global south, but it benefits the world. And then the third piece is really about increasing financing and making good on commitments. many commitments have been made over the years, and we're not necessarily sticking to them. So we'll commit to 100 billion here and 30 billion more recently last year in terms of biodiversity COP. Are we actually delivering that, or are we just recycling the numbers from one pocket to the other and rebranding? So Bridgetown 3.0 focuses on those three themes, but if I could call out just a couple of points. This is a critical year. This is actually a critical moment in the run-up to December for the replenishment of IDA, so the International Development Association replenishment of IDA 21, which is the most important instrument within the World Bank Group for addressing countries that are in the least developed states that have huge levels of poverty and that need IDA to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's something that we collectively need to make happen. But then we also need access, and that's different and distinct from IDA money, to more cheaper, longer-term financing for adaptation. Much of that will go to low income. A lot of it will also go to middle income. And then finally, we need to look at private capital. It's not that private capital has to come to the table because there's not enough public money. That's not why the private sector comes. It's because there's opportunity. But how do you mobilize that capital? What is the public contribution in terms of de-risking, in terms of catalyzing private participation? And really importantly, how do we make sure that the countries in which you're investing are also themselves investing, so that you're leveraging domestic private resources? You're keeping particularly infrastructure assets in the ownership of local companies and local people. And you're not mortgaging, sort of moving from one colonial mindset to essentially selling your assets through foreign direct investment. And then finally, when you think about domestic resource mobilization, why would I as a foreign company come and invest in your country if you're not investing in your country, right?
So I want to get back to the private capital in a moment, but first I just want to ask you about going back to sort of those three different points here. When we're talking about changing the rules of the game, can I ask about when we look at equity to loan ratios in particular, can you explain what you all are advocating for in terms of loans for different countries?
So I'm impressed that you looked that up. That's a very detailed point. So look, within the MDB structure, let's take the World Bank as a particular example. Your equity to loan ratio is going to have a real bearing on how much money you can actually lend to countries. And
just like it does for people, right?
Just like it does for people,
Right.
Exactly. So how much money you actually are able to put out there. And to be very tangible in this space, going from 17 to 18% equity to loan would release about $40 billion. And going from 17 to 19, about $80 billion in additional lendable capital, which is really significant. And you can do that. There's a number of analyses that have been put out recently. You can do that without there being any measurable impact on the World Bank's rating, on its on its strength as an institution. So we're looking not just at, big headline things. We got to do this. We got to shock you in this way so that you just wake up and realize that we have to change the game. No, there's really tangible, boring, nitty-gritty stuff, including, the capital adequacy framework that's in the minutia, but it makes a huge difference, and importantly, without asking for more money from a pocket, right?
I want to ask you about another thing that's in the minutia, but I think is also something people understand very clearly. Hurricane Beryl made landfall as a Category 4 storm this summer. When I ask about how everyone is recovering in Barbados, can I also ask how the storm provided further evidence about the need for some nations to have emergency liquidity funding? We were talking about this before.
This woman's an incredibly good interviewer. You understand your stuff. So one correction, it made landfall as a Category 5. It escalated to Category 5. And just to be clear, that's the first ever Category 5 storm to form in the Atlantic in the month of June. So by the time it hit, it was early July. Actually, I was supposed to travel to Barbados with my children. And I called and they're like, I don't think that's a good idea. So we actually came to New York. So I got a couple of days here. But look, I think it's made very clear, while luckily it didn't do the type of damage that Hurricane Maria did to Dominica, to Barbados, because Barbados suffered in large part from storm surge. So coastal sectors, some tourism, but the fisheries sector is absolutely decimated. And that's really significant. Boats were washed up. And if you look at some of the footage, it's really heartbreaking. But what it did outside of Barbados, to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in particular, to Union Island, to Carriacou and Grenada, absolutely mind-boggling over a period of 3-4 hours, wiped out. And so the instruments that are available address some of these challenges, post-disaster liquidity. The Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank both have instruments, but again, the World Bank has something called the CAT DDO, which is a catastrophe drawdown option, which allows you to trigger after an event emergency liquidity. The problem is that you have to have that in place. You have to have signed and negotiated. And the only country that had done that was Grenada. So St. Vincent, Jamaica, Barbados didn't have a CAT DDO. So it's a little bit like a line of credit if you think about it. It's a loan. It's a line of credit in your bank account. So think if you didn't, when you signed up for your bank account, you didn't say you needed a line of credit and then you bounce a check and you're like, oh dear, I don't have a line of credit. So it just kind of sits there until you need it. But if you don't have it, and you need it, you're in trouble. And so one of the things that we're advocating for is access to a universal contingent liquidity facility. So it's only triggered when you need it, but that's available to all climate vulnerable countries. Therefore, in the aftermath of the disaster, the last thing you need is a prime minister or a president running around trying to mobilize donors, trying to get a donor roundtable and a commitment roundtable. And once you have the commitment roundtable, you know the commitment and cash. There's sometimes a lag and there's sometimes a difference in what you commit and what you receive. And so what we're saying is it wouldn't cost a huge amount. We share the numbers, we run some numbers to have that in place for all countries. And then you can talk about more sophisticated options on top. But at the very minimum, there's got to be that safety net.
So we've talked about a lot of different things here. I did want to go back to the private capital and what you think the role of private capital should be, particularly in countries, what role domestic investment should play.
Right. So look, typically, and again, it's very difficult to generalize. It depends on the nature of the economy. But typically, the private sector is going to go into sectors or spaces that it understands well. So, you can find, interestingly, in the most remote parts of Africa or Asia or Latin America, a Coke bottle, right? You can find... it's amazing to me that you can find Lay's everywhere. That seems to have taken over market share. But in those same markets, you don't find access to LP gas or clean cooking fuels, right? You don't find access to, solar products. Why is it that fast-moving consumer goods go in there? Because they know, right? They ship in, put a margin, sell, and they can create distribution networks. But when it comes to and if there's a problem, they just leave, right? You take your container and you go. But when it comes to infrastructure, you're there for the long haul. You're building 20, 30-year power plants. You're building complex infrastructure for water services provision. You've got to dig the road, put it underground, make sure that you get someone to pay, understand what their default rate is. This is all fairly complex. But who better than the domestic private sector to understand that? I'll give you an example. When we talk about people who don't have access to electricity in slum areas or in deep rural areas, they may not have access to electricity, but they're generally not sitting around in the dark. They may have a generator, they may have a battery from the neighboring village. Someone knows how to provide that technology. Someone knows how to make money out of it. How do you leverage those skills and that business acumen, that cultural sensitivity, the knowledge of the market to actually replace these products with ones that are a little bit more maybe environmentally friendly, a little bit more clean energy, a little bit more innovative? But you can't do that unless you're there for the long haul. And so I would advocate for the domestic private sector in terms of developers, not just investors, developers, to look at new models for infrastructure and basic services provision. We like to talk about shiny things, but ultimately people need water. They need sanitation. They need modern energy that's not burning their eyes out and causing their children to die of, asthma and other particulate-related diseases. These are the things where I think, personally, the private sector should play a much greater role domestically and should be allowed to use models that make sense in their market. So when you take that model to a development bank, typically an international development bank, they say, I don't understand that, I'm not going to fund it. Or you can't give me 3 years of audited statements, or I don't understand your management company. Does he have an MBA? No, but he knows how to serve this market.
One last question for you, Pep. What you're talking about is something I've heard you say before, that countries need to be trusted to provide their own vision for the future. What is your message then to the governments, to the corporations, to banks that can change that cultural shift?
Look, I think countries for a very long time, many countries, again, generalizing, have benefited from lip service, right? So we do country strategy, and we as the multilaterals or the international private sector are going to we want to hear what it is that you want to do, and then we won't necessarily give you funding for that. We'll tell you how we can fund our programs or how our model works better. The reality is that that's changing. Barbados has just completed an $11.6 billion investment plan that looks over, well, I, through the Prime Minister's office, can tell you details about that, and it covers public, private, where philanthropic capital is needed. That's truly country-owned. I mean, truly country-owned. It's gone through cabinet approval. Every single government minister has signed off on it. Every single ministry has been involved. Again, coming back to the analogy of the entrepreneur, who then best to trust has your country's best interest? I think it's just something that its time has come. Multilaterals have for too long created structures that rely on very smart people who really want to do the right thing. You have economists from around the world, but doing the right thing from their perspective doesn't necessarily mean it has the country ownership. So I think with Bridgetown and with other initiatives that are showing that strength of the global south, as well as the allies, I would say, in the global north, mindsets are shifting. What now needs to happen is that I get it, I believe in you, has to translate into, I'm going to give you voting rights on which projects get approved and how country envelopes get signed off on, and how we then meet with you at your seat, at your table, to decide that we're going to fund your program. So I think the shift is taking place. It's just going to require a lot more urgency for it to happen faster.
The Bridgetown Initiative's Pep Bardui, thank you for taking the time to be with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for your excellent questions.
Sure. So thank you all also for being here. Please stick around, have drinks, enjoy some food. We'd love to meet you. Thank you again.